Story 1: The Flute's Lament. Imagine walking through a silent, moonless forest at 3 a.m., only to hear the haunting melody of a flute with no visible source. Would you run or stay to uncover the mystery? Alex and Clarissa had always been fascinated by the unexplained. They had spent countless nights watching documentaries on the paranormal and swapping ghost stories. But when Alex heard about the haunted woods near his hometown, he couldn't resist the temptation. "Come on, Clarissa," he urged one evening. "Just one night. If nothing happens, at least we'll have a great story to tell." The woods, officially named Blackthorn Forest, had a dark reputation. Locals spoke in hushed tones about strange occurrences, shadowy figures, disembodied voices, and most chillingly, the haunting melody of a flute that seemed to come from nowhere. According to legend, anyone who followed the music would disappear, their fate sealed forever. Despite the warnings, Alex and Clarissa's curiosity won out. On a crisp autumn night, they packed flashlights, snacks, and a camera, then drove to the edge of the forest. The air was cold, and a thick fog blanketed the ground. The trees, gnarled and ancient, seemed to lean toward them as if whispering secrets. "This place is definitely creepy," Clarissa admitted, adjusting her flashlight. "That's what makes it perfect," Alex replied with a grin. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the sounds of the outside world faded away. Their footsteps crunched on the fallen leaves, the only noise in an otherwise oppressive silence. The deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to close in on them. The trees were so tightly packed that even the moonlight couldn't penetrate their canopy. After an hour of walking, Alex suggested they rest. They sat on a fallen log, sipping water and sharing nervous laughter. That's when it started. The faint sound of a flute drifted through the trees, soft and melodic. At first, Alex thought it was the wind, but the notes were too distinct, too deliberate. He exchanged a glance with Clarissa, whose eyes were wide with fear. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Alex nodded, his heart pounding. The music grew louder, wrapping around them like an invisible thread. It was hauntingly beautiful, each note tinged with sorrow. "Maybe it's someone messing with us," Alex suggested, though he didn't believe it himself. Compelled by equal parts fear and curiosity, they followed the sound. The path grew narrower, the trees pressing in on all sides. The fog thickened, swirling around their ankles like ghostly hands. Clarissa clung to Alex's arm, her flashlight flickering. The farther they walked, the stranger the forest became. The air felt heavy, thick with an unnatural chill. Shadows moved at the edges of their vision, fleeting shapes that vanished when they turned to look. Every now and then, the flute's melody would change, becoming more intricate, almost like a song meant to guide them. "This is crazy," Clarissa said, her voice trembling. "We should go back. Just a little further," Alex insisted. "We've come this far." The music led them to a clearing, bathed in an eerie silver light. At its center stood a figure, cloaked in shadow, It held a flute to its lips, playing a mournful tune. The figure's face was obscured, but its presence radiated an undeniable malice. "Alex," Clarissa whispered, tugging at his sleeve. "We need to go. Now." Before they could move, the figure turned toward them. The music stopped, plunging the clearing into a deafening silence. Suddenly, shadowy forms emerged from the trees, circling them. The figures were human-like but distorted, their limbs unnaturally long and their faces featureless. They moved with a jerky, unnatural rhythm, closing in with every step. Clarissa screamed as her flashlight died completely. Alex grabbed her hand, and they ran blindly into the woods. The air seemed to thicken, each breath a struggle. The flute's melody resumed, now frantic and chaotic, echoing in every direction. It felt as though the forest itself was alive, branches clawing at them as they fled. Their surroundings blurred, and the world tilted. Alex felt an invisible force pulling him back, as though the music wanted to claim him. Clarissa's grip tightened, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Don't stop. Keep running." Their flight through the forest became a fevered dream of terror. The shadows seemed to morph into grotesque shapes, their whispers growing louder. Alex tripped over a root, nearly dragging Clarissa down with him. He looked back and saw one of the shadowy figures reaching for him, its elongated arm stretching unnaturally far. "Get up!" Clarissa screamed, yanking him to his feet. They stumbled forward, their lungs burning as the flute's melody grew deafening. The fog became so dense that they could barely see a few feet ahead. Finally, they broke through the tree line, collapsing onto the grass beside their car. The music ceased, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. They scrambled into the vehicle, locking the doors and speeding away. Safe at home, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them. He scoured the internet for answers, finding countless stories about the spirit of the forest, a figure known as the Piper, who lured victims with his flute, trapping their souls forever. Some claimed the music was a warning, while others believed it was a curse. Weeks later, Clarissa began having nightmares. She dreamed of the forest, of shadowy figures reaching for her. Alex, too, felt the lingering effects, a faint melody that played at the edge of his hearing, growing louder when he was alone. One evening, as Alex sat alone in his room, he heard the faint strains of a flute. His blood ran cold. He looked out the window and saw nothing but darkness. Yet the music grew louder, clearer. It seemed to come from within the house. Had they truly escaped? Or had the Piper marked them as his next victims? As their story ends, we're left with a chilling thought: some melodies are better left unheard. Story 2: The Haunted Hospital. Hospitals, those towering bastions of hope and healing, are filled with the comforting hum of machines, the soft shuffle of nurses, and the whispered prayers of loved ones. But when the sun sets and the halls grow silent, a different energy takes over, one that can make even the most rational minds question their reality. For Mark, a pharmacy technician working the graveyard shift at a medium-sized hospital in Alabama. The line between the living and the dead blurred one fateful night, leaving scars he would carry forever. Mark had been on the night shift for over 2 years. He liked the solitude and the slower pace. But the schedule took a toll on his mind and body. On this particular Tuesday, he arrived at 6 p.m., greeted by the familiar buzz of fluorescent lights. By the time midnight rolled around, most of the hospital had settled into an eerie stillness. Mark's task for the night was to restock the Omnicell machines in the surgical suites and deliver medications to the various wards. It was a tedious routine, but he preferred it over the chaos of the day shift. As he made his way through the sterile, empty corridors, the silence pressed against him, broken only by the occasional squeak of his cart's wheels. Mark's first stop was the surgical wing. He entered one of the supply rooms and began stocking vials and syringes. He was halfway through when the door behind him creaked open. "Hello?" he called out, pausing his music. No answer. He turned to find the door ajar, swaying slightly as though someone had just passed through. Goosebumps prickled his arms. He stepped out into the hallway and looked both ways. The corridor was empty. Must have been the air pressure, he muttered to himself, though he wasn't entirely convinced. The incident nagged at him, but he forced himself to focus. Hospitals were old buildings, full of drafts and quirks. Or so he told himself. An hour later, Mark moved to the second-floor surgery prep rooms. The lights in one of the rooms were off, but he assumed it was unoccupied. As he pushed the door open, he caught a glimpse of something, a shadowy figure hunched over the sharp disposal bin. "Hey! What are you doing?" The figure didn't move. Mark flipped on the light, and the room was empty. His heart thudded in his chest as he scanned the room. The bin was closed, untouched. There was no sign anyone had been there. "Get it together, Mark," he whispered, wiping his palms on his scrubs. He blamed it on fatigue, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. Around 2 a.m., Mark began his rounds delivering medications to the wards. The 5th floor had always unsettled him. The 5,100 and 5,200 wings were active with patients, but the 5,400 to 5,500 side had been closed for renovations for months. The thought of walking through those empty halls made his stomach tighten. Still, curiosity got the better of him. He finished his deliveries and wandered into the 5,500 wing. The air felt colder here, and every step echoed unnaturally. As he passed room 5512, a sound stopped him in his tracks, a faint, rhythmic rattling. Mark's pulse quickened. He peeked inside the room. An old man lay on the bed, convulsing violently. His eyes were wide open, blood streaming down his cheeks like crimson tears. His mouth gaped in a silent scream, and blood bubbled from his lips. Mark froze, horror rooting him to the spot. The room's heart monitor beeped erratically, the sound rising to a deafening crescendo. "Hang on. I'm getting help," he yelled, stumbling back into the hallway. But as he turned to run, he glanced into the room again, and everything was gone. The bed was neatly made, the monitor silent. It was as though no one had been there. Mark staggered backward, his chest heaving. His rational mind screamed that he was hallucinating, a victim of exhaustion. But his gut told a different story. Shaken, Mark decided to head back to the pharmacy. He pressed the elevator button, praying for the comfort of familiar, brightly lit rooms. When the elevator arrived, the doors slid open to reveal the old man. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The man was standing upright, dressed in a hospital gown. His eyes were no longer bleeding, but they burned with an intensity that froze Mark in place. A sickly, crooked smile spread across his face. The old man raised a hand in a slow wave. Mark's body screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. He forced himself to press the elevator button again, and the doors began to close. Just as they were about to shut, the man's hand shot out, stopping the doors. But when Mark looked again, the elevator was empty. He stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. Mark spent the rest of his shift in the pharmacy, refusing to leave until his replacement arrived. He couldn't stop replaying the night's events in his mind. Had he imagined it all? Could sleep deprivation cause such vivid hallucinations? At 4 a.m., Mark clocked out and hurried toward the exit. He kept his head down, avoiding the darkened hallways and their ominous shadows. As he reached the parking lot, something made him look back at the hospital. In the fifth-floor window of room 5512, the old man stood, watching him. His face was eerily calm, his crooked smile faintly visible in the dim light. Mark didn't wait to see more. He ran to his car, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys. He didn't exhale until he was miles away from the hospital. 4 weeks. Mark tried to rationalize what had happened. He scoured patient records but found no mention of an old man matching the one he had seen. He asked his co-workers if they had experienced anything strange, but most just laughed it off. Rumors of the haunted fifth floor had been circulating for years, stories of whispers in the empty halls, shadows that moved without explanation, and cold spots that chilled even the most skeptical staff. Mark quit the night shift soon after, unable to face the hospital's oppressive silence. Yet, even during the day, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Mark eventually moved to a different hospital, but the memories of that night never left him. Sometimes, in the quiet hours just before dawn, he would hear faint whispers or catch a fleeting shadow out of the corner of his eye. And on particularly restless nights, when sleep evaded him, he swore he could see the old man's crooked smile in the darkness, waiting. Story 3: Basement Intruder. Home is meant to be a sanctuary, a place where you can lock the door, exhale, and let the world's worries drift away. But for Sarah, one seemingly uneventful weekend at home alone turned her safe haven into a stage for terror. It began innocently enough. Sarah, a 27-year-old teacher, had planned a quiet weekend while her boyfriend, Matt, attended a bachelor party in Las Vegas. Their modest one-story home in the suburbs was the perfect place for relaxation. Tucked away on a quiet cul-de-sac with few disturbances, it had 3 cozy bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a basement used mostly for storage. She'd always disliked the basement, though Matt reassured her it was just an ordinary part of the house. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that it held a peculiar kind of darkness, a silence that felt heavier than the rest of the house. That Friday night, as she settled in for a cozy evening, she had no idea how much her instincts were about to be validated. Sarah's evening began pleasantly. She invited a few friends over for wine, laughter, and a rom-com marathon. By 10:30 p.m., her friends had left, leaving her alone in the house. The silence was comforting at first, a stark contrast to the lively chatter from earlier. She brewed a cup of chamomile tea, grabbed a blanket, and settled on the couch to watch an old horror movie. She wasn't easily scared, but halfway through the film, a sharp noise broke her focus. It sounded like a faint tap, like something gently striking wood. She paused the movie, her heart skipping a beat as she listened. Nothing. She laughed nervously, brushing it off as the house settling or perhaps a branch scraping against a window. It was autumn, after all, and the wind outside had picked up. As she resumed her movie, the sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't rhythmic, but irregular, like someone tapping a finger against a wall. Sarah muted the TV and held her breath. The noise was faint but persistent, and it was coming from beneath her. Her stomach churned as she glanced toward the hallway. At the end of it was the door to the basement. It was closed, as always, and she was certain she hadn't opened it all evening. The sound stopped. She waited, frozen on the couch, straining to hear anything else. For several minutes, there was only silence. "You're being ridiculous," she muttered to herself, forcing a laugh. Probably just the water heater or something. Still, she couldn't shake the creeping unease. She grabbed her phone, turned on the flashlight, and tiptoed toward the basement door. With one hand on the doorknob, she hesitated. Then she heard it again, a faint shuffling sound, like feet brushing against concrete. Her hand trembled as she slowly turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing the pitch-black stairwell. She shined her flashlight down but could see only the cluttered basement floor below. "Hello?" she called out, her voice quivering. No answer. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, flashlight trembling in her grip. When nothing happened, she shut the door, locked it, and hurried back to the living room. Sarah tried to brush off the incident, convincing herself it was just her overactive imagination. She double-checked the locks on all the doors and windows before heading to bed. She had just begun to drift off when a new sound jolted her awake. This time, it wasn't tapping, it was a faint, irregular clicking, like fingernails against glass. Her heart raced as she sat up, straining to pinpoint the noise. It was coming from the floor again, from the basement. Before she could summon the courage to investigate, the sound stopped abruptly. Silence filled the room, thick and oppressive. Then, a voice broke the stillness. "You're finally home." The words were low and raspy, almost a whisper, but they echoed clearly in her ears. They came from the basement. Panic surged through her body. She grabbed her phone and bolted out of the bedroom, not stopping to grab shoes or a jacket. Sarah sprinted down the hall and threw open the front door, her bare feet hitting the cold pavement as she ran to her neighbor's house. She pounded on the door, tears streaming down her face. "Please. Someone's in my house," she screamed. After what felt like an eternity, the porch light flicked on, and Mr. Keating, her elderly neighbor, opened the door. His face was a mix of confusion and concern. "Sarah? What's wrong?" "There's someone in my basement," she gasped, clutching her phone tightly. "I heard them. They spoke to me." Mr. Keating ushered her inside and called the police while Sarah sat trembling on his couch. 2 officers arrived within minutes. Sarah led them back to her house, though every fiber of her being wanted to stay far away. The officers searched the entire house, including the basement. Nothing. "No signs of forced entry," one officer said, his tone calm but skeptical. "Are you sure the door to the basement wasn't open earlier?" "I'm positive," Sarah insisted. "I locked it myself. And I heard someone. I'm not crazy." The officers exchanged a glance but didn't argue. They finished their search and assured her they would patrol the area for the rest of the night. The next morning, after a sleepless night at Mr. Keating's house, Sarah returned home with her friend Amy for support. The house was eerily still. Everything was exactly as Sarah had left it, except for one thing. The basement door was ajar. "I swear I locked it," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Amy peeked down the stairs, her face pale. "There's something on the steps," she said. Sarah reluctantly shined her flashlight down. Sitting on the 3rd step was a single key. It was old and ornate, with a dull brass finish, and she didn't recognize it. Amy handed it to her, frowning. "What's it for?" "I don't know," Sarah said, her hands trembling. They searched the house for anything that might match the key, but found nothing. Days turned into weeks, but Sarah couldn't shake the unease. She installed new locks, set up security cameras, and even bought a dog for added protection. But every night, as she walked past the basement door, she felt it, the oppressive weight of unseen eyes watching her. Once, late at night, the motion-activated camera in the basement sent a notification to her phone. With trembling hands, she opened the app and reviewed the footage. The video showed only darkness. But for a brief second, she heard it, a low, raspy whisper. "You're finally home." Sarah and Matt moved out of the house a few months later, unable to endure the growing sense of dread. She never discovered how the basement door had opened that night or who, or what, had whispered to her. And though the house was behind her, the memories lingered. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, Sarah would wake up, certain she had heard it again, the faint tapping, the shuffling steps, and that chilling voice reminding her of a nightmare that refused to stay in the past. Story 4, The Stalker Delivery. The gig economy was supposed to be simple: pick up an order, deliver it to a customer. and get paid. For Jake, an Uber Eats driver trying to make ends meet, it was a job like any other. But one fateful night, a routine delivery would turn into a life-or-death sprint through the dark, leaving him questioning whether he'd ever feel safe again. It was a quiet Wednesday night in the suburbs of Houston, Texas. Jake had been driving since 5 p.m., racking up deliveries to pay off his mounting bills. By 10:30, he was ready to call it quits when a notification popped up on his app. A late-night order from a Chinese takeout place. Last one, he muttered to himself. Accepting the job. The pickup was smooth enough. He grabbed a brown paper bag filled with lo mein and dumplings, punched the delivery address into his GPS and set off. The address was 15 minutes away. But as Jake drove, the area became less familiar. The streetlights thinned out, replaced by dark stretches of road bordered by dense trees. His GPS announced he had arrived. But there was no house in sight, just a narrow dirt path veering off the main road. Jake hesitated, glancing at the map. "Is this right?" he muttered. The app confirmed the location. Reluctantly, he turned onto the dirt path. The path wound deeper into the woods, the thick trees swallowing his car's headlights. Finally, the driveway opened up to reveal a small, decrepit house. The paint was peeling, and the windows were dark. A single porch light flickered weakly. Jake's stomach twisted. Everything about the place screamed, "Don't go in." He parked his car but kept the engine running, grabbing the delivery bag as he scanned the house. "Hello?" he called out, stepping cautiously onto the gravel driveway. No response. He approached the porch, his footsteps crunching loudly in the silence. There was no doorbell, so he knocked. The sound echoed, unnaturally loud in the still night. Seconds passed. Then a minute. Jake was about to leave when the door creaked open slightly. He froze. A man's face appeared in the crack, partially hidden in shadow. He looked unkempt, with greasy hair and sunken eyes that glinted unervingly in the dim light. Uber Eats?" Jake said, holding up the bag. The man didn't respond. Instead, he stepped out onto the porch, his movements slow and deliberate. Jake's unease grew. The man was tall and gaunt, his clothes hanging loosely on his frame. He didn't look at the bag or acknowledge Jake's words. Instead, he stared directly at Jake. "Hey, man, here's your food," Jake said again, trying to keep his voice steady. The man took another step forward. Jake instinctively backed away. You shouldn't have come here," the man rasped, his voice low and gravelly. Jake's heart pounded. "What do you mean? You ordered this, right?" The man's lips curled into a chilling smile, revealing yellowed teeth. He took another step closer. Jake could see the man's hands now, dirty, with long, jagged fingernails. Every instinct in Jake's body screamed at him to leave. "Okay. I'm just gonna leave this here," Jake said, placing the bag on the porch. He turned to head back to his car, but the man's voice stopped him cold. "You shouldn't have come here," the man repeated. This time louder. Jake turned his head just enough to see the man stepping off the porch. He wasn't walking, he was charging. Adrenaline surged through Jake as he broke into a sprint. He bolted for his car, his feet slipping on the loose gravel. He could hear the man's heavy footsteps pounding behind him, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. Jake reached his car, yanked the door open, and threw himself inside. He slammed the door shut just as the man lunged, his hands smacking against the driver's side window. "Get out!" the man screamed, his face contorted with rage. Jake jammed the car into reverse, his tires kicking up dirt as he backed out of the driveway. He didn't stop to see if the man was still following. He floored the gas pedal and sped back down the dirt path. But as he reached the main road, his rearview mirror revealed headlights. The man was in a car now, and he was following him. Jake's heart raced as the headlights grew closer. The man's car, a battered old truck, swerved erratically, its engine roaring as it gained on him. Jake pressed the pedal to the floor, but his sedan struggled to outpace the larger vehicle. The truck veered into the opposite lane, pulling up alongside Jake. The man rolled down his window, and for a brief, horrifying moment, their eyes met. The man's grin was wide, almost inhuman, as if he was enjoying the chase. Jake swerved, narrowly avoiding a collision, and the truck fell back. But it wasn't over. The truck rammed into the back of Jake's car, sending a jolt through his body. "Come on. Come on," Jake muttered, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The road ahead was deserted, with no signs of other cars or houses. He had never felt so alone, and so hunted. Up ahead, Jake saw a narrow side road branching off to the left. Without hesitation, he swerved onto it, his tires skidding on the loose dirt. He turned off his headlights, plunging the car into darkness, and drove as quietly as he could. He pulled off the road behind a cluster of trees and killed the engine, his chest heaving as he tried to stay silent. The truck roared past a few seconds later, its headlights sweeping the road ahead. Jake waited, his breath shallow, until the sound of the engine faded into the distance. He didn't move for a long time, too terrified to risk being seen. When he finally felt safe enough, he started the car and drove back to the city, his hands trembling on the wheel. The next morning, Jake reported the incident to Uber Eats and the police. He gave them the address and described the man who had attacked him. A few hours later, an officer called him back. "There's no one living at that address," the officer said. "The house has been abandoned for years." Jake's blood ran cold. "That's impossible. I was there last night. I saw him." "We checked the property," the officer continued. "It's empty. No sign of recent activity. Are you sure you didn't misread the address?" Jake hung up, his mind racing. He knew what he had seen, and he couldn't explain it. 4 weeks. He couldn't shake the image of the man's gaunt face and predatory grin. He stopped taking late-night orders, unable to face the thought of another delivery going wrong. And sometimes, when he was driving at night, He thought he saw headlights in his rearview mirror, bright and unwavering, as if they were following him. For Jake, the terror came in the form of a relentless pursuer. But sometimes, the fear doesn't chase you, it simply watches, waiting for the right moment to strike. Our next story will leave you questioning what's lurking in the darkness beyond your headlights. Story 5, Silent Watcher. The hum of tires on asphalt was the only sound keeping Erin awake. It was nearly midnight, and she had been driving for hours, her small sedan cutting through the barren stretch of rural road. The trip back home had taken longer than expected due to a series of wrong turns. And now she was on an unfamiliar highway surrounded by nothing but darkness and dense woods. Erin glanced at her fuel gauge. The needle hovered dangerously close to empty, and her phone's GPS had lost its signal an hour ago. The quiet isolation of the road was unnerving. But she reassured herself. Just keep driving. There has to be a gas station somewhere ahead. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, fighting off the weariness pulling at her eyelids. But as the miles ticked by, the monotony of the empty road grew hypnotic, and her focus wavered. That was when she saw it, a shadow darting across the road just ahead of her headlights. She gasped, jerking the wheel hard to the right. The car veered off the asphalt, skidding onto the gravel shoulder before plunging nose-first into a shallow ditch. The impact jolted Erin forward, the seatbelt digging into her chest. She sat there for a moment, her heart pounding as she tried to collect herself. Her hands trembled on the wheel, and she could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Damn it," she muttered, slumping back against the seat. She turned off the engine and tried to restart the car. The engine sputtered but didn't turn over. Erin groaned, banging the steering wheel. Great. Stranded in the middle of nowhere with no cell service. She checked her phone again, still no bars. Taking a deep breath, she decided to step out and assess the damage. She grabbed her flashlight from the glove compartment and opened the door. The night air was cold and carried an eerie stillness, broken only by the distant rustling of leaves. Erin crouched down, shining her flashlight over the front of the car. The bumper was smashed, and one of the tires had gone flat. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. It was clear she wasn't going anywhere tonight. As she straightened up, the beam of her flashlight swept across the trees lining the road, and froze. A man was standing just a few feet away. He was tall and unnaturally still, his face obscured by shadow. His clothes were dark, blending seamlessly into the night. "Hey!" Erin called out, her voice trembling slightly. "Can you help me?" The man didn't respond. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring. Erin's heart raced. She waved the flashlight toward him, trying to get a better look at his face. But the beam seemed to falter, as if the darkness around him was swallowing the light. "Are you okay?" she tried again, her voice louder this time. Still no response. The silence stretched, oppressive and heavy. Erin felt a chill creep down her spine as the man tilted his head slightly, almost as if he were studying her. Her instincts screamed at her to get back in the car, and she obeyed without hesitation, slamming the door shut and locking it. She watched the man through the windshield. Her breathing shallow. He didn't move for what felt like an eternity. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he stepped back into the shadows of the trees and disappeared from view. Erin's fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She scanned the darkness outside, her eyes darting between the trees. But there was no sign of him. "Just a weirdo," she whispered to herself, though her voice betrayed her doubt. She tried the ignition again. This time, the engine sputtered to life. Relief flooded through her, and she quickly shifted into reverse, pulling the car out of the ditch. The flat tire made steering difficult, but she didn't care. She just wanted to get away. As she turned back onto the road, her headlights illuminated something that made her stomach drop. A car was parked sideways across the road ahead, blocking her path. Erin's foot hovered over the brake as she squinted at the vehicle. It was an old, beat-up pickup truck, its paint rusted and peeling. There were no lights on, and the cab was empty. Her pulse quickened. It hadn't been there before. Panic clawed at her chest. Was this some kind of trap? Her mind raced through every horror story she'd ever heard about rural roads and stranded drivers. She shifted the car into reverse, intending to turn around. But the reflection in her rearview mirror froze her in place. The man was back, standing in the middle of the road behind her. Erin's breathing turned shallow and ragged as she gripped the wheel. She had no choice, she had to go forward. She shifted back into drive, pressing down hard on the accelerator. Her car lurched forward, the flat tire thudding against the asphalt as she aimed straight for the truck. The old pickup loomed closer, and she braced herself for impact. At the last second, she yanked the wheel hard to the right, the car scraping past the truck with a screech of metal. The sound was deafening, but she didn't stop. Her heart thundered in her chest as she sped down the road. Glancing in her rearview mirror, the truck and the man were both gone, swallowed by the darkness. But the sense of relief was short-lived. In the distance, she saw headlights. The lights grew brighter, coming toward her fast. Erin pressed the pedal to the floor, her car groaning in protest. The vehicle behind her roared closer, its engine a guttural growl that seemed to echo in her ears. The road twisted and turned, but the other car stayed on her tail, its high beams blinding her. She couldn't see the driver, but she could feel their intent, a relentless, predatory determination. Erin's breath came in gasps as she took a sharp turn onto a narrow side road. The other car followed, but the terrain was rough, and her pursuer's vehicle began to lag behind. Up ahead, she saw a cluster of lights, a gas station. It was closed, but the sight of it gave her hope. She pulled into the lot and stopped under a flickering street lamp. The other car didn't follow. It had disappeared into the night. Erin sat there for a long time, her body trembling as the adrenaline drained away. When she finally felt brave enough, she called the police. They arrived half an hour later, but their search of the area turned up nothing. No truck, no man, no sign of any other vehicles on the road. "Are you sure about what you saw?" one officer asked gently. Yes. Erin insisted. Her voice firm despite the lingering fear. I know what I saw. The officers exchanged a glance but didn't press further. They escorted her to a nearby motel, where she spent the rest of the night. Too afraid to sleep, Erin never found out who, or what, had been stalking her that night. The old pickup truck and the silent man remained a mystery, leaving her with more questions than answers. She avoided rural roads after dark from that night on. The memory of those blinding headlights and the figure in the woods haunting her every time she got behind the wheel. For Erin, the road became a hunting ground, and the terror came from a relentless pursuer. But sometimes, the danger isn't out there, it's already inside. Our next story takes us to a snowbound motel, where the true nightmare begins when the locks are undone. Story 6, The Motel Nightmare. The snowstorm began as Lauren left the last stretch of the highway, the flurries quickly turning into a blizzard. The road ahead was an endless blur of white, illuminated only by her car's struggling headlights. She squinted at the GPS, her frustration mounting as the estimated arrival time to her family's house stretched further into the night. Just one more hour, she muttered, gripping the wheel tightly as the wind howled around her. But the storm was relentless, and her progress slowed to a crawl. When the low fuel light on her dashboard flickered to life, her stomach sank. Lauren pulled over, her heart pounding as she weighed her options. Her GPS pinged, showing a small motel just a few miles off the highway. It wasn't ideal, but with no other choice, she tapped the directions and pressed on. The Maple Creek Motel came into view like a mirage, its flickering neon sign barely visible through the thick curtain of snow. The parking lot was empty save for a single truck buried under layers of white. The building itself was worn and lonely, with faded yellow paint and dim porch lights barely cutting through the storm. Lauren parked her car and stepped out into the biting cold. The wind whipped around her as she hurried inside, her boots crunching on the ice-covered walkway. The motel's lobby was just as uninviting, dimly lit, with outdated furniture and the faint smell of mildew. A man stood behind the counter, his face lit by the pale glow of a small television. He didn't look up as Lauren approached. "Hi. I need a room for the night," she said, her voice breaking the heavy silence. The man finally glanced at her, his expression unreadable. He handed her a key without asking for her name or payment, muttering, "Room 7. End of the hall." "Thanks," she replied, unnerved by his disinterest. The hallway leading to her room was narrow and dimly lit, the carpet frayed at the edges. Room 7 was at the very end, its door scratched and scuffed as if it had seen years of heavy use. Inside, the room was sparse but functional, a small bed with a floral bedspread, a wooden dresser, and a heater humming softly in the corner. Lauren locked the door, securing the deadbolt and the chain before setting her bag on the bed. She kicked off her boots and changed into warm pajamas, sighing as she sank into the mattress. The heater filled the room with a steady warmth, and the storm outside faded into a muffled background noise. Exhaustion began to creep in, and Lauren let herself drift off, lulled by the rhythmic sound of the wind rattling the windows. Lauren woke suddenly, her heart racing. The room was cold, The kind of bone-deep chill that made her shiver even under the blankets. She glanced at the heater, it was still running. Its red light glowing steadily. That's when she noticed the door. The deadbolt was undone. And the chain lock hung limply, swaying ever so slightly. Her breath caught in her throat. She sat up slowly, every nerve in her body on edge. She was certain she had locked the door before going to bed. A low creak echoed through the room. The sound unmistakable. Someone was walking in the hallway outside. "Hello?" Lauren called out, her voice trembling. No response. She reached for her phone, turning on the flashlight as she crept toward the door. Her heart pounded as she peered through the peephole. But all she saw was darkness. Another creak. Closer this time. Before Lauren could react, the doorknob began to turn. Slowly, deliberately. She stumbled backward, her mind racing. The door opened an inch, the chain catching it with a metallic clink. A shadowy figure stood just outside, its features obscured by the faint light spilling in from the hallway. The figure didn't move, but Lauren could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on her chest. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "What do you want?" The figure tilted its head slightly, as if studying her. Lauren's fight-or-flight instincts kicked in. She grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp from the nightstand, and held it up defensively. "Get out!" she screamed, her voice cracking. The figure remained still for a moment, then retreated silently into the hallway. Lauren slammed the door shut and locked it again, her hands trembling as she slid the dresser in front of the door for good measure. She dialed 911, her voice frantic as she explained the situation to the dispatcher. "Stay on the line." "Ma'am," the operator said calmly. "Officers are on their way." Lauren sat on the bed, her back pressed against the wall, clutching the lamp tightly. Every creak and gust of wind outside sent her heart racing. Within 15 minutes, flashing red and blue lights illuminated the parking lot. 2 officers knocked on her door, their presence a small comfort in the oppressive silence. Lauren recounted everything: the unlocked door, the shadowy figure, the footsteps. The officers listened carefully before beginning their search of the motel. The officers combed through the entire building, checking every room and corner of the property. But they found nothing. "There's no one else staying here tonight," one officer said, his tone laced with doubt. Lauren's stomach dropped. "But I saw them. They were right outside my door." "There are no footprints in the snow," the officer continued. "If someone was outside your room, they didn't leave any trace." Lauren insisted on showing them the door, pointing out the locks. "I locked these before I went to bed. They were undone when I woke up." The officers exchanged a glance but didn't press further. They advised her to stay somewhere else for the night and promised to patrol the area. Lauren packed her belongings quickly, eager to leave the motel behind. The storm had subsided by dawn, leaving a pristine blanket of snow over the parking lot. As she loaded her car, something caught her eye. Just outside her window, half buried in the snow, was a small, rusted key. She picked it up, her fingers numb from the cold. It was old and weathered, with an ornate design that seemed out of place. A chill ran down her spine. She didn't recognize the key, and it didn't match the lock on her room door. She left it where she found it and drove away, the unease clinging to her like a second skin. 4 weeks. Lauren replayed the night in her mind, searching for explanations. How had the locks been undone? Who, or what, had been standing in the hallway? She avoided motels from that point on, opting for crowded hotels with bright lights and security cameras. But even in the safety of her own home, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. And sometimes, late at night, she would wake suddenly, her heart racing. It was always the same, a faint creak, a whisper of footsteps just outside her door. For Lauren, the nightmare came with the creak of a door and the chill of a shadow. But sometimes, the danger doesn't wait outside, it steps into your backyard and asks to come in. In our next story, an uninvited guest brings terror to a quiet home in the middle of a snowstorm. Story 7, Uninvited Guest. The snowstorm rolled in earlier than forecasted, draping the quiet suburban streets in thick, swirling white. Ellie pulled her sweater tighter around her as she sat by the window, watching the wind hurl snow against the glass. It was a night for staying in, cozy, safe, and alone. Her cabin stood at the edge of the neighborhood, surrounded by a thicket of tall pines that swayed ominously in the storm. She usually loved the solitude, but there was something different about tonight. The howling wind and the way the snow muffled every sound beyond the walls gave her an uneasy feeling, like the world had been swallowed whole. She turned her attention back to the book on her lap, telling herself she was being ridiculous. But by midnight, that illusion of safety would be shattered. Ellie was halfway through a chapter when she heard it, a sharp, deliberate knock at the front door. Her heart skipped a beat. She lived alone, and visitors were rare, especially this late. She set her book aside and approached the door cautiously, her socked feet silent against the wooden floor. She peered through the peephole. A man stood on her snow-covered porch, hunched against the wind. He was dressed in a thin, tattered coat, his shoulders dusted with snow, and his face was pale, almost ghostly. Under the dim porch light, Ellie's stomach tightened. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away, and she hadn't seen any cars pass by for hours. What was this man doing out here in the middle of a storm? He knocked again, louder this time. "Please," he called out, his voice muffled by the wind. "I need help. Let me in." Ellie hesitated, her hand hovering over the lock. Every instinct told her to help him. No one could survive long in weather like this. But something about him unsettled her. His eyes darted around nervously, and he kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone, or something, to follow him. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't let you in." The man stepped closer, his breath fogging the glass as he pressed his hand against the door. "Please," he repeated, his tone growing more urgent. "Just for a few minutes. I won't hurt you. I promise." Ellie's unease deepened. "I'll call for help," she offered. There's a shelter in town. Someone can come get you. No. His voice rose sharply, startling her. You have to let me in. Right now. His sudden intensity made her take a step back. I'm sorry, she said again. More firmly this time. I can't. The man's expression changed. The desperation in his eyes gave way to something darker, an anger that sent a chill down her spine. Let me in, he said. His voice low and menacing. Ellie backed away from the door, her heart pounding. I'm calling the police, she said. Loud enough for him to hear. But when she returned with her phone and looked through the peephole again, the man was gone. She scanned the porch and the driveway beyond. But there was no sign of him. Only the wind and snow greeted her, covering any trace of footprints. Her hands trembled as she dialed the local non-emergency line. A dispatcher answered, her tone calm and professional as Ellie described what had happened. Officers are on their way, the dispatcher assured her. Ellie locked the door, double-checking the deadbolt and chain, and retreated to the living room. She sat on the couch, clutching her phone, her eyes darting to every shadow the firelight cast on the walls. 15 minutes passed. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. But inside, the cabin was eerily quiet. Ellie began to convince herself she had overreacted. Perhaps the man had truly been in need, and now he was wandering through the storm, alone. And then she heard it again. A knock. Soft this time, almost hesitant. Her heart stopped. She crept back to the door and peered through the peephole. The man was back. But something was different now. He wasn't knocking anymore. He was standing perfectly still, his hand resting on the doorknob. His head was tilted slightly, and his eyes were fixed directly on the peephole, as if he knew she was watching. Let me in, he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. Ellie stumbled back, panic surging through her. She grabbed the largest knife from the kitchen and called 911. Her voice shaking as she described the man outside her door. Stay on the line, the operator instructed. Officers are nearby. As she spoke, the doorknob began to rattle. First gently, then violently. Go away, Ellie shouted, clutching the knife tightly. The rattling stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the pounding of her heart. And then the thuds began, loud, forceful blows against the door, as if the man were throwing his entire weight against it. Ellie screamed, backing into the corner of the living room. The knife trembled in her hands as she waited for the door to splinter. But it never did. The sound of sirens cut through the storm, growing louder by the second. The thudding stopped abruptly. When Ellie dared to look through the window, the man was gone. 2 police cars pulled into the driveway, their headlights cutting through the swirling snow. Ellie unlocked the door cautiously, her relief palpable as 2 officers stepped inside. She recounted everything, from the man's initial knock to the violent attempts to break in. The officers listened intently, then searched the property and surrounding woods. But they found nothing. No footprints, one officer said, shaking his head. The snow's untouched. Ellie's stomach churned. That's impossible. He was here. He tried to get in. The officers exchanged a look but didn't argue. We'll patrol the area tonight, the second officer assured her. Call us if you see anything else. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. Ellie stayed awake, her knife by her side, flinching at every creak of the house. When dawn finally broke, she ventured onto the porch to inspect the snow for herself. Just as the officers had said, there were no footprints leading to or from the house. But there was something else. Near the edge of the porch, half buried in the snow, was a small, rusted key. Ellie stared at it, her breath fogging in the cold air. She didn't recognize it, and it didn't match the lock on her door. She left it where it lay and went back inside, locking the door behind her. Ellie never found out who the man was or how he had vanished so completely. She installed new locks and security cameras, but the memory of his pale face and unblinking stare haunted her. And sometimes, on stormy nights, she thought she heard it again, a faint knock at the door, just loud enough to make her wonder if he had come back. For Ellie, the danger came knocking in the dead of night. But in some places, the terror doesn't knock, it waits for you to walk right into its trap. In our next story, a delivery driver learns the hard way why some neighborhoods should stay empty. Story 8, Empty Neighborhood. The nights were always the hardest part of Ryan's job. As an Uber Eats driver, he was used to working late, navigating dark streets, and dropping off orders to people too tired or busy to cook. Most nights were uneventful, with the occasional rude customer or wrong address. But one night, a delivery to an unfamiliar part of town changed everything. It started like any other shift. Ryan's phone pinged at 11:45 p.m. with a new order. The promised tip was unusually generous, enough to make him ignore his fatigue and accept the job. The pickup was from a 24-hour diner downtown, a greasy paper bag filled with burgers and fries. The address was unfamiliar, and the GPS showed it was in an upscale neighborhood far from the city center. Ryan shrugged, figuring it was an easy drive with little traffic. He couldn't have known he was driving straight into a nightmare. The road leading to the neighborhood was eerily quiet, shrouded in fog that seemed to swallow his car's headlights. Streetlights became sparse, and the houses were set farther and farther apart, their windows dark and lifeless. Ryan felt a prickle of unease as his GPS directed him onto a narrow, tree-lined street. The houses here were massive, their driveways long and uninviting. It was the kind of neighborhood where you'd expect high fences and security cameras. But tonight, it felt abandoned. When he finally reached the address, his stomach twisted. The house at the end of the cul-de-sac was enormous but clearly neglected. Its paint was peeling, the shutters hung crooked, and the overgrown lawn was littered with debris. The only sign of life was a single dim porch light flickering weakly against the darkness. "This can't be right," Ryan muttered, double-checking the address. But the app confirmed it. Ryan parked at the base of the driveway, leaving the engine running as he stared at the house. It didn't look like anyone had lived there for years, but someone had ordered food. He hesitated, then grabbed the bag and stepped out into the chilly night. The gravel crunched under his boots as he approached the porch. The stillness was suffocating, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. "Hello?" he called out, knocking on the heavy wooden door. After a moment, the door creaked open, and a woman appeared. Her face was pale, her hair disheveled, and her eyes darted nervously as if she was expecting someone else. She wore an oversized sweater that hung loosely on her frame, giving her a frail appearance. "Thank you," she said quickly, taking the bag from his hands. "Hold on. Let me grab your tip." Ryan nodded, shoving his hands into his pockets as she disappeared back inside, leaving the door slightly ajar. Ryan waited on the porch, shivering as he glanced around. The dim porch light barely illuminated the driveway, but something caught his eye near his car. A figure stood in the shadows at the edge of the driveway. Ryan squinted, his heart skipping a beat. The man was tall and motionless, wearing a dark hooded jacket. His face was obscured, but his stance was unnerving, rigid and predatory, like he was waiting for something. "Hey!" Ryan called out, his voice echoing in the silence. "Can I help you?" The figure didn't respond. The woman reappeared in the doorway, holding a crumpled bill. "Here you go," she said, thrusting it into his hand. "Do you know that guy?" Ryan asked, nodding toward the driveway. Her expression froze. "What guy?" Ryan turned back, but the man was gone. Ryan's unease grew as he made his way back to his car. His footsteps quickened, his eyes darting to every shadow. He unlocked the driver's side door and was about to climb in when he heard heavy footsteps behind him. Before he could react, a hand clamped down on his shoulder, yanking him backward. Ryan spun around to face the hooded man, who loomed over him with a menacing grin. The man's breath smelled of alcohol, and his eyes gleamed with malice. "You're not going anywhere," the man growled. Adrenaline surged through Ryan as he twisted free, stumbling backward. He turned and bolted toward the woods at the edge of the property, the man's footsteps pounding behind him. The forest was dense, the trees clawing at Ryan's face and clothes as he sprinted deeper into the darkness. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his legs burned with every step. But he didn't dare slow down. The man's heavy breathing and crashing footsteps followed close behind, growing louder with each passing second. Ryan's mind raced. "Don't stop. Don't trip. Just keep going." A root snagged his foot, sending him sprawling to the ground. Pain shot through his ankle, but he scrambled back to his feet, ignoring the throbbing ache. He spotted a faint light in the distance, headlights cutting through the trees, bursting into the clearing. Ryan waved his arms frantically as a police cruiser screeched to a halt. Two officers jumped out, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. "He's behind me," Ryan shouted, collapsing to the ground. The hooded man emerged seconds later, freezing when he saw the officers. He turned to run, but they tackled him to the ground, pinning him with practiced precision. Ryan watched from the grass, his chest heaving as relief and exhaustion washed over him. As the paramedics checked Ryan for injuries, one of the officers approached, "We checked the house," he said. "It's empty." Ryan blinked. "What do you mean?" The woman who answered the door. "There's no one inside," the officer interrupted. "That house has been abandoned for years." Ryan's stomach turned. "But I spoke to her. She took the food. She gave me a tip." The officer frowned. "The house doesn't even have power." "Are you sure?" Ryan didn't answer. He didn't know how to. 4 days. Ryan replayed the night in his mind, searching for answers. The hooded man had been arrested, but his connection to the house, or the mysterious woman, remained unclear. Ryan avoided deliveries in that part of town after that. The memory of the mansion's flickering porch light and the shadowy figure near his car haunting him. Sometimes, late at night, he would check his rearview mirror and swear he saw someone standing in the shadows, watching him drive away. For Ryan, the terror came from the shadows of an empty neighborhood. But on some roads, the danger isn't waiting, it's staged, ready to ensnare the unsuspecting. In our next story, a driver encounters a sinister trap that turns a rural drive into a deadly game. Story 9, The Hitchhiker Incident. Rural roads had always held a strange allure for Adam. He loved the isolation, the way the stars seemed brighter without city lights, and the quiet hum of his car as it glided over long stretches of empty highway. But one late-night drive through an unfamiliar back road taught him a lesson he would never forget: some roads were better left unexplored. Adam was driving home after a long day of work. His company had sent him on a last-minute delivery to a small town 2 hours from the city. And by the time he finished, the clock was pushing 11 p.m. His GPS showed a route that cut through a rural area, shaving 20 minutes off his drive. He decided to take it, figuring the shortcut would get him home faster. The road was narrow and winding, bordered by dense woods on either side. The moonlight barely pierced the canopy of trees, leaving the path ahead shrouded in shadows. Adam rolled down his window slightly, the cool night air a welcome relief after a long day. The first sign that something was wrong came about 15 minutes into the drive. Adam rounded a bend and spotted something unusual ahead. A car stopped in the middle of the road, its hazard lights blinking weakly. Behind it, an old pickup truck was parked diagonally, partially blocking the lane. He slowed down, squinting to get a better look. The sedan's hood was popped open, and a man stood beside it, waving his arms. His silhouette was illuminated by the truck's headlights, casting long shadows that danced across the asphalt. Adam felt a twinge of unease. The scene looked off, though he couldn't immediately pinpoint why. He slowed to a crawl, keeping a cautious distance. As his headlights swept over the scene, he noticed 2 more figures standing near the pickup truck. They weren't moving, just watching. The man by the sedan waved more urgently. "Hey! Can you help us?" he called out, his voice carrying over the quiet night. Adam's gut told him to keep driving, but the man's desperate tone made him hesitate. "Damn it," he muttered, inching his car forward. As he rolled down his window, Adam kept one hand on the gearshift, ready to take off if anything seemed wrong. "What's going on?" he asked. His voice steadied despite the growing tension in his chest. The man gestured toward the sedan. Car broke down. Batteries dead. Can you give us a jump? Adam glanced at the figures near the truck. They were still standing motionless, their faces obscured by the shadows. His unease deepened. Sorry. I don't have jumper cables, Adam said quickly, his instincts screaming at him to leave. The man's expression shifted, his friendly demeanor giving way to something darker. Oh. Come on. Man. Don't leave us stranded out here. Adam's hand tightened on the gearshift. I can call someone for you, he offered, already putting his car into reverse. Before he could move, one of the figures by the truck started walking toward him. Adam's pulse quickened as he saw the glint of something metallic in the man's hand, a crowbar. The figure from the sedan reached into his jacket, pulling out a knife. Stop the car, the man shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. Adam didn't think. He slammed the car into reverse, his tires screeching as he backed up. The man with the knife lunged at his driver's side window, slamming the blade against the glass. Get out, the man yelled, his face twisted with rage. Adam hit the gas, spinning the car around in a cloud of dust and gravel. He floored it, speeding back the way he had come. But his rearview mirror showed the pickup truck roaring to life behind him. The truck's headlights grew brighter, its engine a guttural growl that filled the night. Adam's heart pounded as the truck closed the distance between them. The narrow road made it impossible to maneuver, and the pickup was gaining fast. He swerved to avoid a pothole, his tires skidding on the loose gravel. The truck rammed into his rear bumper, jolting his car forward. Come on. Come on. Adam muttered, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He spotted another bend in the road up ahead and took it sharply, hoping to lose the truck in the darkness. But the pickup's headlights stayed on him, relentless. A gunshot rang out, shattering the rear windshield. Adam ducked instinctively, shards of glass scattering across the back seat. Desperation took over as Adam saw a narrow dirt path branching off the main road. He yanked the wheel hard, his car veering onto the uneven terrain. The truck hesitated for a moment before following, its headlights bouncing wildly as it sped after him. The dirt path led to an old wooden bridge spanning a shallow creek. Adam didn't slow down, his car barreling across the rickety structure. The planks groaned under the weight of his vehicle, but he made it across. The pickup truck wasn't as lucky. The bridge collapsed under the truck's weight, the wooden planks splintering with a deafening crack. The truck's front tires plunged into the creek, leaving it stuck at an awkward angle. Adam didn't stop to look back. He drove until he saw the faint glow of a gas station on the horizon. The safety of civilization finally within reach. Shaking, Adam pulled into the gas station and called the police. He recounted everything: the roadblock, the chase, the gunshot. Officers arrived quickly and escorted him back to the site. The pickup truck was still there, abandoned in the creek. Inside, they found weapons, rope, and zip ties, leading them to suspect the men had planned to rob him, or worse. We've had reports of similar setups in the area, one officer said grimly. "You're lucky you got away." Adam nodded, though the word lucky felt like an understatement. 4 weeks. Adam avoided rural roads, choosing longer, busier routes no matter the time of day. But even in the safety of his apartment, he couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Sometimes, late at night, he would wake to the sound of tires crunching on gravel or the faint echo of a gunshot in his dreams. And every time he looked in his rearview mirror, he half expected to see a pair of headlights bearing down on him. For Adam, the terror came on a desolate road, where escape seemed impossible. But sometimes, the danger doesn't come from outside, it's already there, watching you from the shadows. Our next story takes us to New Year's Eve, where a solitary night ends with a horrifying discovery. Story 10, Shadow at the Window. New Year's Eve was meant to be a peaceful night for Michelle. After a grueling year, she had decided to forego the noise and chaos of celebrations, choosing instead to stay in the cozy confines of her home. Her single-story cabin, nestled on the edge of a snow-covered forest, was the perfect place to welcome the new year in solitude. Michelle had spent the day preparing for her quiet night, a bottle of her favorite wine, a stack of classic movies, and a warm fire crackling in the hearth. Outside, a gentle snowstorm blanketed the world in white, silencing everything beyond her walls. It was supposed to be the perfect night. But as the clock ticked toward midnight, Michelle's sanctuary became a prison of fear. And the quiet snowstorm revealed a dark presence she could neither see nor explain. The evening began as planned. Michelle sat curled up on her couch, the soft glow of the fireplace casting dancing shadows on the walls. A romantic comedy played on the TV, its cheerful tone a sharp contrast to the storm brewing outside. By 9 p.m., the snow had intensified, and Michelle noticed the windows rattling faintly in their frames. She glanced outside, marveling at how quickly the snow was piling up. The scene was beautiful yet eerie, an empty, snow-covered world with no signs of life. She took another sip of wine and tried to focus on her movie. But a faint sound interrupted her thoughts. It was subtle at first, barely audible over the wind, a rhythmic crunch, like footsteps in the snow. Michelle muted the TV, straining to hear. The sound stopped. She shook her head, dismissing it as her imagination. But a faint unease settled in her chest, and she got up to double-check the locks on the doors and windows. An hour later, Michelle decided to make herself a cup of tea. The kitchen was dark except for the faint glow of the porch light filtering through the window. As she waited for the kettle to boil, she glanced outside. That's when she saw them. Footprints in the snow, leading from the edge of the forest directly to her living room window. Michelle froze, her breath catching in her throat. The tracks were fresh, the edges sharp and untouched by the wind. Her mind raced. She had been sitting in the living room all evening, oblivious to whoever, or whatever, had been watching her. She quickly turned off the porch light, plunging the yard into darkness. Gripping her phone tightly, she stepped back from the window, her pulse quickening. Michelle retreated to the living room, locking the doors and pulling the curtains shut. She told herself it could have been a prank, a neighborhood kid playing in the snow. But her house was far from any other homes. And the isolated location made the thought of a prankster unlikely. As she sat back on the couch, trying to calm her racing heart, a soft noise broke the silence. It was faint but deliberate, a tap against the glass of her bedroom window. Michelle's chest tightened. She stood slowly, her feet silent against the floor, and moved toward the hallway. She didn't want to look but felt compelled to confirm what she already feared. She peered into the darkness of the bedroom, her heart hammering in her chest. The curtains were drawn, but the faint outline of a figure was visible against the thin fabric. Someone was standing just outside the window. Michelle stumbled back, nearly dropping her phone. Her fingers trembled as she dialed 911. "There's someone outside my house," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The dispatcher's calm voice did little to ease her panic. "Stay on the line, ma'am. Officers are on their way." As she spoke, the figure moved. The shadow shifted away from the bedroom window. And moments later, Michelle heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through the snow. They were heading toward the back door. She ran to the kitchen, grabbing the largest knife from the drawer and bracing herself against the counter. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, all she could hear was the sound of her own breathing. Then came the rattling. The doorknob twisted violently, followed by a series of loud bangs as the intruder tried to force their way inside. Michelle's grip on the knife tightened as tears streamed down her face. The bangs grew louder, more forceful, and she was certain the door wouldn't hold much longer. "Go away," she screamed, her voice cracking. The pounding stopped. Silence enveloped the house, thick and suffocating. Michelle's hands shook as she strained to hear any sign of movement. Suddenly, the front door handle jiggled, followed by the sound of heavy breathing just outside. She ran to the hallway closet and slipped inside, pressing herself against the wall. Her knees buckled, and she slid to the floor, clutching the knife in one hand and her phone in the other. Minutes passed like hours. The only sound was the faint hum of the heater and the distant howl of the wind. The sound of sirens pierced the silence, their red and blue lights reflecting off the snow. Michelle exhaled a shaky breath, her body trembling as she emerged from the closet. She unlocked the door cautiously, relief washing over her as two police officers stepped inside. They were trying to get in, Michelle said, her voice hoarse. "I saw them. I heard them." The officers conducted a thorough search of the property. They found the footprints leading to the windows and doors. But they stopped abruptly at the edge of the forest. "There's no sign of anyone nearby," one officer said, frowning. "We'll patrol the area, but it looks like they're gone." Michelle nodded, though the reassurance did little to calm her nerves. The officers left, and Michelle spent the rest of the night awake, every creak of the house sending her heart racing. When dawn finally broke, she ventured outside to inspect the yard. The footprints were still there, their path unmistakable. But as she followed them, she noticed something chilling. The tracks didn't lead away from the house. They circled it, over and over. as if the intruder had been stalking her all night. She returned inside, locking the doors and windows again. But the feeling of being watched never left her. Even weeks later, Michelle couldn't shake the memory of that shadow at the window. Every time she passed by a darkened glass pane, she felt the prickle of unseen eyes watching her, waiting for Michelle. New Year's Eve became a night she would never forget, a night when her home became a cage and the snow outside revealed the presence of a predator. And that, dear travelers of the dark, concludes tonight's journey into the shadows. But remember, the stories don't end here. Every shadow, every whisper, every unexplained chill down your spine, those are tales waiting to be told. At Wolf Tells, we thrive on the unknown, the terrifying, and the truths that hide in plain sight. If you've enjoyed this dive into the darkness, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Click the bell icon, so you never miss a tale that might just be closer to home than you think. The next story? Well, let's just say it will leave you questioning what lies on the other side of that door you thought was locked. Until next time, stay safe, if you can.